This video will contain spoilers for Xenoblade. Which one of them? Yes. Just all of them. There's no real way around it with this topic, I'm sorry. There were two major theories people had going into the Xenoblade 3 era of the series. The first is that Mio would turn out to be Nia's daughter. This one looked pretty strong, then they kind of debated us with it for most of the game because we learned how soldiers in Aionios worked and it seems like none of them could be kids of anyone from previous games. And then they basically undebated us in the post-game by more or less outright confirming it. The second theory is that Aionios would end up being the past of the world of Mira from Xenoblade X. That one definitely ended up wrong, as we clearly see both the creation and destruction of Aionios with no real room for a spin-off to take place. That being said, there's clearly a lot of X's DNA across 3 in gameplay, world, and story, so there may just be something to that second theory after all. Mira isn't the Aionios we see in 3, but I still think it's an Aionios. A different Patchwork Endless Now made from a different universe. X had a lot of unused concepts that never made it into the final game, and we know how Monolith likes to reuse ideas, so I don't think it's a stretch to say that some of those could have made it into 3. If you've seen some of my older X videos, I've definitely talked about all of this before, but this is my first time addressing any of these topics since even learning there'd be a Xenoblade 3, let alone playing it, so some of my views certainly have changed. We never learned exactly what Mira is, so it could very well have been basically Aionios the entire time and we'd never know, and they just kind of quietly shoved that into 3 on the down low. Also, the Lifehold works very similarly to Origin, albeit even less explained, and the city has pretty heavy NLA vibes, complete with deceptively old white-haired Full Metal Jaguar. I say this, but even though Xenoblade 1 and 2 do give conflicting accounts of Earth's destruction, they both conflict even harder with X's, so X definitely takes place in a different universe than Klaus's experiment. As an aside though, there could easily be a different version of Klaus working on Earth in the X universe, he just wasn't the one responsible for destroying it this time. While there's no confirmed Zohar or Conduit in the X universe, barring the shape of the Lifeholds, it's very likely that there is at least some kind of meta-universe manifold tied to it, as the Samarians, the alleged ancestors of humanity and creators of the Ganglion, are said to have arrived at the dawn of time in X's universe from a different one, in very Xenosaga reminiscent ships. I personally believe that they came from a new universe, one we haven't seen outside of this, so not the one of 1 and 2, but it's also possible that the experiment shunted more people than just Klaus and Galea across space-time. This obviously isn't a perfect comparison, but of course the biggest potential wrench is Tatsu. He and the other Napon of Mira love to reference Xenoblade 1, and if you take some environmental similarities into account, you can reasonably make a case that the planet is a far future version of 1's world. This doesn't even necessarily conflict with 3, as Aionios is split back up at the end, so even if Noah and Mio manage to reunite, a far future post-3 world could still theoretically become this planet with something about it. That was honestly a very sensical reading of the situation pre-2's release, but I think now that we know X is a spin-off of the wider Xenoblade ecosystem, we have to reevaluate the references. Just think, if 2 released before X instead of the other way around, would the references in X really just be to 1, or would they include 2 as well? X is a spin-off, hopefully a spin-off series, in the same multiverse, but a different base universe to 1, 2, and 3, so in current year, I do think it's more reasonable to say that the 1 references are just fan service. As another aside though, it is kind of funny. It's been confirmed that all of Xenoblade takes place in the same multiverse, but all things considered, we've only really seen 2 universes in it. X is its own universe, and I guess technically the one the Samarians came from could be a third, and then 1, 2, and 3 are all different branches and permutations of the original Earth that Klaus came from, so we're coming up on 13 years of Xenoblade, and Earth has only been destroyed twice. I think that might be a personal best by Xenoseries standards, so we take those. Anyway, X's Napon culture has a story similar to that of Xenoblade 1, passed down in legend, but it seems unlikely that the real game of Xenoblade 1 is in their past. At most, the rifts from Future Connected absorbed some Napon into the X universe, and that's where the Miran Napon society comes from, somewhat similar to the theory that we actually saw what became Telethia the Endbringer go in a portal in Future Connected. With that out of the way, let's look at Aionios for a little bit. It's pretty clearly a damaged patchwork of stuff in the middle of a seemingly endless sea. Many regions in it heavily resemble Xenoblade 1, with a particularly iconic landmark being a piece of the Mechonis in a desert. Mira is a planet, but we've only seen the 5 quote-unquote continents that are really only about the size of one when combined together, even in the intro, with only one ocean as far as the eye can see beyond that. It's not clearly a patchwork, but with how the biomes of the continents rapidly shift without any real in-world justification, it's definitely a theory I've seen in the past. Also, it has a giant ring in its desert area that looks a hell of a lot like the Mechonis' shoulder, and people have been saying that since before X came out. What makes the comparison way more interesting, though, is some of X's concept art. There's a concept piece of Kaldros labeled Old Roth, suggesting that part of Gajarg's homeworld became a piece of Mira somehow, and also that the other continents could in fact come from other planets in X's universe. That's not all, as there's also this somewhat legendary page of the art book that I'm sure I've talked about in depth at least twice before. Do keep in mind, this page is from the confidential section, which is mostly unused stuff from the previous more expanded story, so it might not be completely canon, but the Roth image surprisingly is not, being in the general environment section. Either way, the legendary page has 2 pieces of art on it. The first depicts the entirety of Mira, which seems to be split into chunks by a strange Mobius-esque purple energy. The text box says that NLA is the city in the lower left, and that most crucially, only the landmasses near it are the in-game areas, elaborating that Mira must have many more continents than we've seen, with special attention given to the North Pole Tower. It's definitely worth pointing out the second city on the lower right too. This piece is where all the theories came from in the past, but I think we need to talk about the second one below it too, as that depicts a cliff over nowhere breaking apart at the edge. The text for this piece reads, Mira idea. In the corners of the world or extreme high altitudes, we could have land that doesn't look quite finished, or you can see blocky land patterns on the summoned, with a question mark, alternate world borders. This translation was done by Lugo Banda for the Xenomira WordPress blog. I've used this exact blog post before in a video, link will be in the description. So, we have the Rothian homeworld making up part of Mira we've explored, many parts of Mira we haven't explored, very Mobius-looking energy, and familiar-looking, falling-apart land at extremities of the world. That's a lot of similarities, but can we get much higher? I mean, even more? Yes. Yes, we can. Something I've mentioned before is how the Ghosts, the second faction that fought over Earth against the Ganglion, bear a lot of resemblance to the Gnosis from Xenosaga. Xenoblade 3 had another Gnosis reference, Mobius itself. To explain much more would-be Saga spoilers, but the Ghosts in Mobius draw from the same well, and the weird Mobius presence in Origin is one of the most striking comparisons, as these strangely named enemies with warped appearances are a lot like Gnosis designs. Honestly, the entire Origin trek until you get to the part where you confront X, Y, and Z brings to mind a dungeon from Xenosaga 1 that takes place inside a Gnosis-controlled planet, which is extremely important because the only thing everyone can agree on about Origin is how much it resembles X's technology, particularly that of the Ghosts. Want to go one step further? Too bad, it's happening anyway. Let's look at the next page. I've talked about it before too. It shows a mysterious ship in orbit above Mira called the Rose Garden, stated to have unknown purpose, as well as a giant altar-like structure, and yeah, both look a lot like Origin. Even with that addition though, I'd still say that we only have circumstantial evidence that at most proves Aionios used some unused Miran concepts in addition to ones from 1 and 2, but there is more! Let's try and adapt a theory I've seen in the past to a post-3 landscape. That theory is that Mira is Purgatory. Most of the races that end up there seem to be going extinct or at risk of doing so, even the Ganglion now that human DNA is at amongst the stars. Basically, everyone who describes getting stuck on Mira mentions seeing the same white light, with as far as we can tell only NLA outright crashing normally, as the intro doesn't seem to show that light for humanity. Getting Purgatory out of that is a pretty easy leap, and despite the cliche, I do kind of like that theory, as it actually feels like something a Xenogame would do and not a complete cop-out like similar fan theories usually are. It also works with how humanity is still alive after the core's destruction, as Purgatory isn't something you can exactly escape easily. Basically, to start, we're going to take the word Purgatory in this theory and replace it with Endless Now. My initial pre-3 take on this theory was that Mira itself is sentient and actively capturing endangered sentient races and keeping them stuck there as an act of preservation. Now, I think that it's more like some sort of failsafe made by the Samarians in case their interference in the universe got too out of hand, which it kind of did given how the society they founded controls several galaxies. And yeah, I suppose it could still be sentient because, you know, Trinity processor and all that. I personally believe that the Samarians were a spacefaring strain of humanity in the vein of Xenosaga society from a universe we've never seen before that used the power of a conduit to travel to the Big Bang of X's universe. We also know that you don't even need the power of a conduit to create a device capable of making Aionios, as the one Klaus used in his experiment was long gone by the time Origin was built. Needless to say, if the Samarians were able to use a conduit to intentionally do something more impressive than what Klaus did by accident, they'd easily be capable of making something on the level of Origin, especially if they kept their conduit with them when they went to X's universe. The Rose Garden ship would be that Origin, and while the concept art doesn't really say if the altar is on it or not, I'm gonna just pretend that it is for the sake of this theory, and that Rose Garden grabbed pieces of planets, flora, fauna, and sentient life that was in danger of going extinct, and pieced it all together to create the new planet Mira, one that exists outside of time and not on any star chart. Mira being weird with space is easy enough to prove, as multiple non-human races do still have space-worthy ships and have tried to leave to no effect, but the fact that it's also weird with time is the real kicker. Remember, a far future human somehow time-traveled his way to Mira, and the planet keeps him from escaping back to his home time. I'd say a planet stuck in one moment of eternity is the exact kind of thing you can't use time travel to escape. 3's Aionios exists specifically at the point in time when the 1 and 2 worlds collided, but I'm not fully sure when Mira is. It could just be 2056 when the White Whale crashed there, but it could also be some point later, like when Professor B comes from, some point earlier, like whenever the first race was preserved, when the Rose Garden was activated, or even all of those times and none of those times simultaneously. What I think, though, is that Mira exists at whatever point in time the Samarians made their first action that would alter the course of life in X's universe. So if things went wrong, they'd be able to collect all of the species that they affected with that, and basically do a reset back to that point in case they really screwed things up. You may have an issue with the idea of Mira collecting pieces of planets and non-sentient beings in addition to sentient ones, but there is room for that. The Orphean Ova recognizes Telethia the Endbringer, an entity which as far as we can tell is not as sentient as something like a Callian case, from its original home planet, and while Mira's ecosystem seems reasonably coherent and not bodged together from different sources, so does Aionios's. Granted, Xenoblade 1 and 2 have a lot of species in common, but from what little biological information we have of Mira's indigens, it does seem like there might have been multiple independent instances of life arising, so either convergent evolution happened or creatures from different source planets eventually evolved to coexist. And hey, there are plenty of plant and monster species in Xenoblade 3 that we don't see in either 1 or 2, so either they came from titans in Aurust we never saw before, or time being frozen doesn't mean that evolution will stop. The other potential problem is the lack of any Earth landmass. If Rothians got stuck on Mira and a piece of their homeworld became Cauldros, why isn't there a chunk of planet Earth around somewhere? Well, Earth got destroyed by an antimatter explosion, so it's not like there's a lot of stuff to even get in the first place without actual time travel. And also, if you really think about it, the Lifehold can recreate Earth life, just not human bodies. With a combination of that, NLA legitimately being a city from the planet, and what looks like a second Earth city on a different continent in the concept art, I'm not sure they'd even need to outright uproot any landmass to still have Earth preserved. I really like this preservation theory, but it does somewhat conflict with what little we know about the Samarians. They created the Ganglion as a slave race, they seemingly created the Zarubagan in a similar manner, and they went to another universe and messed with it a lot, with their legacy being a giant multi-galactic crime syndicate, so I'm not quite sure why the same people would actually make a failsafe or an Aionios or something to preserve life at all. To put it bluntly, I don't really know. This is the kind of thing we'd expect to find out about and get an explanation for in a second Xenoblade X game, but it took 3 for me to even get as far as the what, so until we get X2, I'll always be stretching for the why. I used to think Mira was some kind of universal constant, an inevitability that all Xenoworlds find themselves in eventually, but if it's an Aionios, it does have to at least be partially manufactured, and the Samarians are still the only people in X's universe who seem like they'd be capable of doing something like that. While I do think Mira is an Endless Now, and Lao coming back to life at the end of the game does seem a lot like a Mobius awakening, I don't think it was caused by the exact same thing as 3. The creation of Mira may have been done with malicious intent, but I doubt it was Mobius energy taking over the Rose Garden. If anything, it's the reverse. The Garden and Lifehold are similar enough to Origin for the Black Knight to be created, and bring Lao back as something similar to Mobius. I also believed that the worlds Mira was made from came from a bunch of different universes, and that Mira was basically the trash bin at the end of the Xeno multiverse, but knowing now that Origin was only built to deal with 2 universes that used to be one universe, I'm pretty sure the only ones we need to worry about are X's base one, and the one the Samarians hail from. Going back to my malicious intent comment from before, if anything, Mira is the exact opposite of that. If the Samarians were largely monstrous, playing God, there may have been a Galea analog trying to stop them. That person could have easily started a faction that was opposed to the whole toying with life thing, and created the Rose Garden and the Mira Project in order to save life in spite of everything, even if they could never stop the majority of their society from doing terrible things. While we don't know for sure if Earth humans in X's universe were descended from the Samarians like has been claimed, I really like the idea that this super advanced civilization went around and found a universe where life wouldn't exist on Earth normally, then made that entire universe their playground by engineering creatures and starting life on Earth themselves. If that's the case, I'd be willing to bet that 2050s era humans not knowing their true heritage is actually a gift from the Rose Garden faction, as that knowledge would certainly perpetuate their arrogance. The Ganglion also believe that Mira is a key to finding the Samarian homeworld, and I have absolutely zero idea where that fits in here. Maybe the first bit of planet it was formed around is a chunk of their Earth, or the core is one of their weird ships. Hell, maybe the Rose Garden faction managed to steal the Samarian conduit and have it stuck at Mira's core. That'd be a good way to become the enemy of wannabe gods and make them form a massive empire just to try and hunt you down. This could even be extrapolated to L's people being descendants of the Gardeners, but that might be taking it too far. Although that would make them angelically benevolent people seen as demons to Greater Samar, and L is named after Lucifer. Ultimately, I do think the Aionios part is correct, but a lot of this other conjecture is wrong. If it does end up still being canon that the Origin analog that made Mira what it is called the Rose Garden, then I'd definitely be more willing to believe the preservation angle, because that just sounds like the kind of name that would go with something like that. While basically everything I had to say about Samar was extrapolating and taking inspiration from other Xeno games, I do have one last mind blow to end you on. If Mira was made by Samarians who wanted to preserve the life their society was messing with using their advanced technology, that would technically make them Saviorite rebels. Just some more food for thought. Have a good one and see you next time. Except not really, because this is the normal end of the video type thing. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I'd say if you made it 18 minutes into a Xenoblade X Xenoblade 3 video, you're probably going to like a lot of the other content I have on my channel, so if you have not done so yet, I would recommend liking, commenting, and subscribing, because all of those things help me out a lot, and just generally make it better for me to make more stuff that you can also see. I'd also love to give a massive thank you to the patrons whose names you've either seen before or are still seeing on screen now, because it's thanks to their support that I can do a lot of this cool stuff, and, well, I didn't really do a lot of uploading this month, so this is one of the 2 things they're probably going to get, and they deserve all of the thanks for still supporting me despite my massively inconsistent upload schedule. But yeah, the next video I'm likely to put out is going to be on April 1st, so don't expect anything completely serious from that one. And then I have a lot more Xenoblade 3 things to talk about, because this story never truly ends. Until then, though, this is Luxon, signing off.